Okay, um, thank you all very much for participating in this wherever you are. All of us are doing our very best to try to figure out how to move forward with everything. Uh, what I'm going to be doing is I'm going to make a few short videos that will hopefully keep everything as simple as possible. So instead of the more interactive type of um, classes that we are going to be having, I'm going to be just making these simple videos to communicate the most basic information that I want you to have as we talk about mental health. So before we start, I'm going to make a statement. This is something that I will always do, and it's something that I would have done at the beginning of the semester if this were my class, but this isn't my class. So I'm going to do this now, sort of an introduction to me and my sort of teaching style. Um, I'm not going to be going into anything that's too controversial over the next couple of class periods, but um, there are a few things that I want to address that are kind of based on some of the private conversations that some of you have been having with me as we've talked about various things related to medical anthropology through the semester. And I want to address a few of those things right now just to be as clear as I can be about uh, what we do as medical anthropologists and what I believe is I'm trying to hopefully teach something about mental health. But to start out, I want to be clear that I do know that I have a subject position. I am a cisgender white man. My life experiences have been shaped by that in a lot of ways. I understand that we live in an intersectional society where all of us are shaped by uh, various identities that we wear, and unfortunately, a lot of that shaping comes in the forms of privilege and oppression. I benefit from white privilege whether I want to or not. I benefit from male privilege whether I want to or not. And I benefit from heteronormative privilege whether I want to or not. I also grew up in a poor family in rural Appalachia, and I was surrounded by a lot of the things that are associated with poverty in our society, various kinds of abuse and addictions, and a whole lot of things that are that sort of fit into the sphere of mental health matters. I've been exposed to those things throughout my life, as I'm sure probably all of you are have been in different ways. A lot of the experiences that I had as a child and a youth were interpreted to me through this lens of various mental health diagnoses that were carried by people in my community and family. I also served in the military for some years and participated in a colonial war as a combat soldier in an infantry unit. And mental health, as I'm sure many of you know, is an issue of great significance in the military as well, though it operates and is waged in a very distinct and particular kind of way there. I encountered this in an embodied kind of way when I was wounded in combat and retired by the military, and I had to navigate the mental health labyrinth in both my home and in the clinic. And this experience made a significant contribution to my perspective as a medical anthropologist and as a human being. So, to tie this in with some of the conversations we've been having over the past several weeks, for the sake of clarity, the worlds of mental health and psychiatry are very important to me. I've been surrounded by these diagnoses my whole life, like I said, and my constitution as a veteran in my post war life was overdetermined by the PTSD diagnosis that I was issued while making the transition into the civilian world. And we'll talk about that a little bit more when we talk about PTSD later. I do identify to some extent with what we've called critical medical anthropology. And when we're discussing critical medical anthropology, it can sound sometimes like we're trying to say, um, it can sound like we're trying to say that diagnoses are not real, or that physicians or other professionals who work in biomedicine are a negative force in the world. Or we might sound like we're trying to say, for example, that when a psychiatrist is trying to treat a patient with a psychiatric diagnosis, that they're being bad. And I admit that my discipline has put some work out there in the past that can read that way a little bit. And I want you to know that I do not agree with that. Um, I don't identify with that kind of analysis, and it's not the kind of message that you're going to get from me. I value medicine very much, and all of you, this class is filled with people who are going to be physicians one day, people who are going to be leaders in the fields of public and global health, and I value your contribution very much. There's immense suffering in the world, and I value the commitment that all of you have to use the talents that you bring to the table to address that suffering in the ways that you can. As a medical anthropologist, I do take seriously my discipline's commitment to understand the social and cultural dimensions of medicine. And I'm dedicated to a better understanding of the things that are taken for granted in my society. Whatever we study, that's something that we anthropologists always pursue. In the case of diagnosis, in its various expressions and contexts, sometimes there are things that we take for granted. Our goal and my goal in interrogating the social dimensions of things like diagnosis and treatment is twofold. First, I'm trying to understand something bigger about my society as a whole. Biomedicine is a major, very powerful arena in our society, and a lot of the economic and social relations that we encounter in our day-to-day lives are structured by the language and priorities of biomedicine. And second, I'm concerned with things that get overlooked and overdetermined by biomedicine's structural logic. I think that whatever fields we're all going into, whether they're public or private, whether clinical, theoretical, or applied, or if you're going to work in academia or in industry, it's beneficial for all of us to be able to mindfully question the structures that we work within. Doing so makes us better at working within those, whatever we're doing. And there's something specific that I want to acknowledge too, which is that you are all very, very smart. You're very informed, and the way that my discipline works, some of the big reveals of medical anthropology are presented in a way that makes that's based on assumptions that were made about you and who you are, that were sort of from a model 20, 30, 40 years old in our society. What I mean by that is that all of you are able to think critically in a way that previous generations, including mine, struggled with. And this is due to a lot of things, including changes in how information spreads in our society. And I see this, and I've seen this even with a lot of faculty that I know, people in my department or in other places, that a lot of what we as critical social scientists imagine that you do not know and that you may be resistant to involves a lack of understanding of the kinds of things that your generation had to understand while growing up in a changing world. And a lot of us have not realized this yet. For example, 20 years ago, when I was getting ready to graduate from high school and pursue the things that were going to be next in my life, I think it was a bit more mind-blowing when students got hit with what would be Joe Dumit's argument in his book Drugs for Life. Like when a medical anthropologist would tell a class something like, did you know that profit-motivated pharmaceutical companies have had a powerful influence over everything from what we imagine to be a disease to how your physician is likely to suggest major interventions in how you live your life? I think that was a much more difficult thing to accept 20 years ago than it is now. I'm not saying that it's less true, but I do think that it's easier for you to wrap your minds around this because you've been watching these things happen throughout your lives in ways that were more obscure when I was young and were much more obscure when people older than me were growing up. And I don't want to insult your intelligence. Sometimes anthropologists, especially critical anthropologists, not just medical, can get a little bit too wrapped up in our sense of ourselves as mavericks who are bearing dangerous knowledge to naive masses. And when we get too wrapped up in that, we miss the opportunities that exist for us to learn together. And to be completely honest, um, I'm I'm not fond of the classism and elitism that's endemic to that way of thinking. Um, so as we apply this to mental health, it does get tricky. There's a paradox in our society. We simultaneously realize that mental health is underappreciated and deserves much more attention. while we also fail to understand or treat mental health in a holistic way. Uh, as a corollary to this, from a critical research perspective, the field of mental health is one of the easiest places to examine the social constructedness of diagnosis. Um, the suffering that's associated with these diagnoses is also something that is very real. It's profoundly real, and it's not going to get better on its own. So, the anthropology of mental health uh, is, among other things, study and navigation of the intersections of these paradoxes. Again, that there's something acknowledged in our society called a mental health crisis that our society fails to address in a holistic way, and that the field of mental health itself, as an object of research, abounds with the kinds of social constructions that anthropologists study, but also include real suffering and real interventions that make people's lives more livable. Um, so from here, we're going to go on, and I'm going to talk a little bit about some of the readings that I assigned you about the DSM and such. And like I said, I'm going to try to keep all of this as basic and simple as possible. I'm going to send you all a list of the terms that I want you to know from these uh, sections, and I'll be in touch with you with those things very soon.